context that we're here with. So the subject that we've got that we're going to be hearing about for the next hour or so is at some point going to be very challenging. I think some of this content is hardly to listen to. So again, encourage you to apply some of the self-care, some of the things that you have already been doing after this session. Take some time out, go for that walk, whatever it is that you need to do. We've got three fantastic speakers. We've got Suzanne Jacob, CEO of SafeLives. Could you wave, Susan? You might not be able to see her because there's lots of people on the screen. And then we've got Heidi Davies, HR and Policy Advisor from the Greater London Authority. And we've got Diane Keith, Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Lloyds Banking Group. And as you all know, the subject that we're going to be talking about is domestic abuse. Each year, 2 million people experience some form of domestic abuse, and of that, 82% are women. The cost to businesses is 1.9 billion, and it's inextricably linked to mental health. 42% of people experiencing domestic abuse will also be experiencing mental health problems. 61% are more likely to experience PTSD, and 17% have planned or tried to die by suicide. You will all be aware from the news that the significant rise in domestic abuse in the current climate. 2 women a week die from, on average, die from domestic abuse. The comparative data for this time last year and previous years shows that the increase has gone up to 4, so it's 50% increase in the deaths from domestic abuse. The calls to national helplines have gone up by 700%. So I was speaking to some of the helpline chief executives on this subject and the increase in the demand for services. Website increase usage or call access to or call for help have gone up by 150%. And from that, the services that are allocated specifically for men have gone up by 25%. I think it just goes without saying, you're all member leaders that are leading on the mental health strategies of your organisations, and this is another place where I think we can ensure that we're providing support to some of the people who are clearly going to be working in our businesses, who will be suffering in silence. And, you know, domestic abuse is not just physical, it's psychological, sexual, financial, emotional, coercive control, and technological abuse. So I think we're going to be hearing a little bit more about that. I think the context itself is set. What we want to do in this conversation is talk about and think about and reflect on what it is that we can do using some of the examples that will be presented. So I'll stop there and hand over to Farima to moderate the panel.
Thank you, Poppy. Thank you. And hello, everyone. How are you? Just before we get started on our conversation today, where we focus about domestic abuse and on what workplaces can do to help, I just want to say that we'll have all 3 speakers, and then at the end, we'll open it up to questions from the group, and that can be via the chat function, or you can shout out. But if you could hold your questions until the end, that would be brilliant. But please feel free to put them through chats as we go, as they occur to you. So today we will start with Suzanne. Hi, Suzanne. I think you're on mute. Oh, you're there.
Yeah.
How are you today?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. Thanks. And thanks very much for inviting me into this.
Oh, no, thank you very much for joining us. I wonder if we could maybe start, Suzanne, with just a bit of an introduction to SafeLives.
Sure. So SafeLives is a UK-wide domestic abuse charity. We're a bit of the baby in the bunch in some ways, in that we're about 15 years old, whereas of course there are very august organisations that have been around for much longer. We were created with the premise that we ask a great deal in this country and in many other countries, why doesn't she just leave? And actually we're more interested in the question, why doesn't he just stop? And the whole kind of basis for SafeLives being created was the idea that somebody shouldn't have to leave their home in the middle of the night with a bin bag of stuff under one arm and the kids under the other and go and live in a secret location hundreds of miles away, completely disrupting their life when they'd done absolutely nothing wrong. To us as an organization, that doesn't feel like an adequate response. It doesn't feel like a modern response, and it definitely isn't based on what's right and fair. So the whole kind of existence of SafeLives came from the idea that somebody should have a right to stay safely in their own home, and that we need to make all of the kind of practical provision for that to be possible. And as the sort of disciplines of the organization, we kind of work around what we feel is a bit of a magical three, which is hard data. So we collect a lot of data as an organization. We hold the biggest cumulative data sets on domestic abuse anywhere in the UK. We also work a lot with survivors on their ability and space to use their own voice to talk about their experiences. And that's the second element, is that voice element. And then the third is that we're an organization full of practitioners and problem solvers. So many people in the organization either come from a frontline background in specialist domestic abuse response. So they might be what we call IDVAs, Independent Domestic Violence and Abuse Advisors, which is somebody who walks alongside a victim and helps them to be safe in their own home. So lots of ex-IDVAs in the organisation, a number of ex-police officers, some ex-social care team members, but lots of people from that very sort of practical background. And we're constantly, as an organisation, looking for improvement, not just in outcomes, but also the practice that goes into achieving those outcomes, and gathering more colleagues into the conversation to change the response to domestic abuse, whether that's as an employer, whether it's as a specialist practitioner, whether it's as, you know, somebody who works in a statutory agency. We'll work with anyone.
Great, thank you for that introduction and important work. And yeah, today I think we really want to focus on what is the practical response that we can do now. So we heard some really stark and devastating numbers at the beginning from Poppy. I wonder if you could give us a little bit more background about what the situation is now with domestic abuse at the moment in the country.
Sure. So those numbers were really shocking, but even they don't tell the full story. So I guess, you know, just starting with that figure of 2 million people having experience a year around domestic abuse, there's a sort of artificial age limit to the way that data is captured by the Office for National Statistics. So that's only people between the ages of 16 and 55. So we know that children are victims in their own right of domestic abuse. They don't just witness it, or, you know, it's not kind of just either visible or whatever. They are daily living the experience of there being abuse in the home. And we also know that over 55s are not in some magical way immune to experiences of domestic abuse. So that 2 million figure, whilst it's absolutely astonishing, and we talk about domestic abuse as the epidemic before the pandemic, it's still not the total. Equally, in terms of that horrifying number, which has been very consistent for a long time, around 2 women murdered by a partner or ex-partner every single week in this country, again, we probably don't think that's the full picture. So when you take into account unexplained deaths, and also when you take into account suicides, which may have been predicated on experiences of abuse over many months, years, or even in some cases decades, that loss of life to domestic abuse is actually much higher than it looks. But Poppy was absolutely right to say in her introduction that not all domestic abuse looks the same, and certainly not all domestic abuse results in homicide or suicide. Not all of those 2 million people are having that exact same experience. And I guess one of the things that I always want to say from a SafeLives perspective is that there is no them and us to domestic abuse. So when we all here are gathered to talk about it this afternoon, it's not them out there, it's us in here. And we always work from a position that in any room, in any conversation, even if it's just 2 people, is a very, very high likelihood that somebody will have an experience either as a child or as an adult of something happening in their own life. And so I just always kind of want to put that on the table, so that we always remember that it's us in here. We are the people who are experiencing domestic abuse just as much as anybody else. In terms of how it looks for people at the moment during the COVID period, and I guess it's not just lockdown, but the kind of COVID period more generally, is the kind of normal tenets of domestic abuse are being very strongly exaggerated by the current situation. So domestic abuse is about power and control over another human being or set of human beings. It's about bending them to your will and getting them to do things that you want them to do rather than things that they might choose to do. It's about removing elements of their identity so it better fits your view of what's acceptable. And it's about isolating them from aspects of their life which would dilute your influence. So you can think then in terms of lockdown about the inability of somebody to get out from behind that closed door to their workplace, to their children's school, to their own school if they are children, to their friends, to their other family members who are not collusive in the abuse, and to generally kind of dilute the impact and that level of control that somebody exerts over their life. That's all very, very heavily constrained in this period of lockdown. And we have heard instances of even the very small number of methods people have for still being kind of in contact with the outside world, such as going to do the shopping. In some instances, the abusive partner is saying, I'm going to do all of the shopping, I'm going to hold all of the finances. So actually, then the non-abusive partner has no recourse to be outside the home. And of course, if you're a child during lockdown and you're living in a house where there's abuse going on, you don't have that same kind of respite that you would normally have 7 hours out of the day at school 5 days a week. You know, you're literally living and breathing that situation 24 hours a day, in which there might be a very high level of control and there might be a very high level of fear, even if that's not necessarily the fear of physical violence, but it is the fear of consequences of some kind. And I think, you know, in me talking about that, hopefully you can already begin to imagine really, really clearly what the mental health implications of that situation would be, particularly over a protracted period. We know exactly as Poppy said, that people coming out the other side of domestic abuse situations, be they adults, children, adolescents, will carry very significant mental health impressions. We also know that those people who are using abusive behaviours, there's quite a, although the research on people who are using abusive behaviours is much more limited than on victim survivors, we know that there's a very strong correlation in some instances, in some forms of perpetration, with mental health issues, including all the way up to suicide ideation. And if we accept that there's no them and us about becoming a victim of domestic abuse, we also have to accept that there's no them and us about perpetration either, and that within all of our workforces, there will be people who have either done something they regret or have done something that they don't regret, but we would consider to be unacceptable. So in terms of that mental health correlation with domestic abuse, we also know that it looks slightly different for different groups of people. SafeLives does a lot of research, and one of the things that we focused on over the last couple of years is the different barriers and additional barriers being faced by particular groups. And what that showed was that if you identify as being from an LGBT plus community, you are twice as likely to be self-harming and more likely to be considering suicide if you're in an abusive relationship or you've had an abusive relationship than if you consider yourself to be heterosexual. We also know that there are higher rates of mental health concern for people who are disabled and who have an experience of domestic abuse.
Yeah.
So there are correlating factors there which make it more difficult for somebody to reach out potentially, make it more difficult for somebody to get the help that they really need, and something that's suited to them and meets all of their requirements.
Thank you. And so there's clearly significant stigma, and at the moment there are significant barriers. for getting the support and help that you need, and there's an increased there's an increase of it happening. We've talked previously about it being a workplace issue, but at the minute the workplace for many people is having the most contact with potential people who are potentially victims. We're going to be coming on to talking to some of our members about what they're doing. Do you have any suggestions as to what workplaces should be thinking about in terms of supporting their people who may be victims of domestic abuse, and actually anything in terms of, and I don't know what this would look like, challenging the perpetrators of it?
So I think in terms of the current situation, you're right. I think, you know, there's a kind of almost a unique opportunity for employers at the moment to be the people who are able to help and support somebody and be that first point of contact. We know that not all organizations feel confident to go particularly far with that. And there's no judgment when I say that. This isn't a particularly easy issue for people to consider, although I do think, and we'll hear from Diane shortly about what LBG have been doing, you know, as organizations are kind of brave about what they choose to do about that, actually what you find then is that there's a really, really positive snowball effect, in that then team members start coming to you saying, well, we could do this or we could do that. And the levels of interest within the organization are there and waiting if the organization feels confident enough to kind of lift the lid a little bit. And this obviously follows on from things that, of course, the members of the Alliance will be very familiar with around mental health, which was a few years ago. Employers were very uncomfortable with these conversations, but have made such great strides in supporting people to bring more of themselves to work and be treated as whole human beings rather than just, you know, the kind of professional automatons. So at the very, very simple end, if this is the appetite that an organization has, you know, it could be very, very simply just making sure that line managers who are checking in with their team members during this time feel confident just to ask some very simple questions of their team members. We would not recommend that people say, are you experiencing domestic abuse? Many people don't recognize it as domestic abuse or wouldn't associate themselves with that particular language. But just checking in with, you know, are you feeling safe at home? Are you feeling comfortable at home? Are you feeling okay? You know, just these very, very simple opening questions, and then just leaving sufficient space for somebody to fill that space. I think one of the other very simple things is making sure that as an organization, there's a recognition of the very high prevalence of domestic abuse in society at large, and therefore that will be reflected in your workforce. So there is no workforce that is somehow immune from this, no level of educational attainment or income or anything else, it, you know, kind of removes you from this. And making that clear in all your kind of all staff comms is a really powerful thing, because it means that you're opening up a conversation inside the organization which says this can happen to anybody. And there is no judgment taken on the part of the organization if this is happening to you. We're here to hear about it and support you. If somebody does choose to disclose something, that's obviously a really, really big step for them. But there's no need for people to feel really overwhelmed if that happens. You know, if you're a line manager or HR team member, you know, there will be really simple things that you could do for somebody to make them feel supported. Of course, believe them, of course, validate them, validate the fact that it's taken a great deal for them to speak out and to say something about that. And then be led by them about what they think the implications of that are, because survivors of domestic abuse may have been living in that situation for a very long time and will have extremely intricate coping strategies for their situation related to the particular behaviors of their perpetrator. And so the organization doesn't need to kind of come up with all of that for that person. It's about supporting them in some of the kind of flexibility they might need or some of the choices they might make, and being as supportive as possible. Also recourse to things like your employee assistance program. You know, if somebody needs to access something that's a slightly more structured way of doing things. And of course, having access to the details of specialist organizations. So there's a huge amount of detail on our website about organizations who can support. And that's from the very kind of big national helplines through to more specialist helplines geographical specific aspects.
Thank you.
And so on.
Thank you. We'll make sure that we include that list of organisations in a roundup that we send to our member leaders. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Lots of good advice there on practical suggestions for opening a conversation, because I know that, I think, is a big challenge. If you don't mind, if you can stay with us, we may come back to more questions. If we can move on to you, Heidi, now. Hi, are you okay? Can you hear me okay?
There we are. I'm unmuted now. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Yes, I'm fine, thank you.
Good, thank you for joining us. Heidi, I wonder if you could just share with the group what you have been doing at the GLA to support.
Okay, well, we have actually had a policy or policies on domestic abuse, and there was another one on violence against women and girls for quite a number of years now. And you know, the background to this is that it's something that the Mayor has always had an interest in and strongly supported. So some people may have seen the recent press release relating to the investment of further money for the provision of safe accommodation for those affected by domestic abuse. So that's a sort of background to it. But we introduced a new policy in December 2019, so before the current lockdown. And little did we know then, when we introduced both this policy and our bereavement policy, how topical sadly they would both become. So the new policy was put in place because we had some feedback from our women's network in particular, and others, that there was a need for them to be updated, both in terms of content and language. You know, the sentiments were good, but there wasn't a lot of practical help there. The language was not particularly helpful. It really wasn't very inclusive. There was a focus on women. Men were mentioned, but very much as an afterthought. No mention of the LGBT plus community, etc. So we've made the policy more inclusive, more supportive in its tone, and have included a lot more practical support, which of course a lot of it relates to the workplace. So in the current lockdown situation, some is useful, some not so useful, but you know, we will eventually find our way back into workplaces. Shall I just run through?
Yes, if you could run through what you're doing to support staff, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, so what we aimed to do really was to raise awareness, create a safe and supportive environment, enable managers to recognise the potential signs of abuse, and to have those appropriate conversations sensitively and confidentially, as I say, to offer some practical help, which I'll go into a bit of detail on in a minute, and to signpost to the the long list of other organisations that Suzanne mentioned. We made changes. We've included coercive control. We've included some specific guidance on stalking, and I'll just run through some of the practical things that we did too. One of the things that we've done is to give up to 10 days paid leave for anybody affected by domestic abuse, to give that sort of flexibility that somebody may need to take the time out to make arrangements, whatever it might be. We've also offered the facility for an interest-free loan. Other financial measures include the ability for somebody to have their salary paid in a different way. We've emphasised the flexibility that we give in terms of working patterns, and potentially also the job that somebody does. So if somebody needs we have a smart working policy anyway, and obviously staff can make flexible working requests, but we've stressed that the emphasis is very much for managers to look upon those requests favourably. We of course have the usual ability for somebody to talk to a range of people, the employee assistance programme, member of HR, their line manager, colleagues. We have staff networks and a trade union. So all of those are potential potential sources of help.
One question. So it sounds like there's lots of great policies. Do you offer training to the line managers, or is there a quick training to help line managers know about the policies, feel comfortable to have the conversations, and also bearing in mind COVID lockdown where managers can't actually come into the office for the training? Yeah,
it's something we're thinking about. Yes, you're right, there were requests for training, and we get that with each of the policies that we introduce. It's a difficult one. This is something which managers will always need to be aware of and aware that it might happen. But in terms of specific training, we have 1,000 staff, so to get all managers through a sort of program like that, we're thinking about ways that we can potentially build it into other training or induction. What we have done, though, is to publicise. We publicise new policies and procedures to all staff on the intranet. They are readily available. We plan to put on occasional lunchtime workshops, and we have recently, in relation to the current lockdown situation, reminded all staff of the policy and where it can be found. So certainly a high level of visibility. Training is something that we're still considering, thinking about the best way to do that.
Okay, and so this is a really good list of practical measures. I just want to make sure that we haven't missed anything that you're doing, because I think I interrupted you when you were going through the list. But so you, as well as raising awareness of it as an issue, you have interest-free loans, salaries paid in different ways, and 10 days paid leave people need. Is there anything else that you're offering?
We will. There's a whole list of practical things that we potentially can do if somebody is able to ask for help. So we've consulted our technology group and our facilities management group in relation to things that we can do to help. This is very much geared to the workplace, but to help people stay safe in the workplace. So that might be, for example, if somebody has a job which is very front-facing, so on a front desk somewhere, they could request to be moved to something else which is not so visible. If somebody is experiencing phone calls from an abuser, there are measures that we've said we can put in place, to prevent that. If people are willing to disclose to colleagues, which is entirely their choice, of course, we have encouraged colleagues to think about things like escorting to and from the station or whatever, or making those occasional phone calls to check that somebody's safe. Very, very practical things like that, and there's a whole list of them. Very happy to share the policy document if anybody's interested in it.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you. Have those to share. That would be brilliant. So thank you. Also, we might come back to you for questions. I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to move on to Diane. Diane, are you there?
I certainly am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. How are you, Diane?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. So Diane, it would be brilliant if you could talk to us about what Lloyds Banking Group has been doing to support staff who may be victims of domestic abuse, particularly in this time of COVID-19.
Yes, I think particularly at this time, I think, Suzanne talked about organisations not seeing themselves as being immune. I think that's something we take extremely seriously with 65,000 colleagues and 30 million customers. So it's been a real issue for us for some time, but we know all of the issues are heightened in the current situation. So we've done a couple of things most recently that I'll just touch upon, if that's okay.
Please.
One of the first things we did is we work continuously with our charity partners, and Suzanne at SafeLives is a very trusted part of that small team. So we work with SafeLives, Surviving Economic Abuse, and Tender, just to make sure that what we are considering as being the right support is the right support and also delivered at the right time. We were looking at the potential issue of many of our colleagues who probably find work a safe place to go to escape from situations. And obviously, with everybody working from home, that really has become a problem. And we also speak to a lot of our colleagues who are really willing to come forward now that we've really normalised the conversation around domestic abuse and really help us think through what are the key things that we can do at real moments of truth. So, we do recognise that there may be a need for one of our colleagues to have to escape a situation at this time. So we fast forwarded our plans and launched a couple of weeks ago our group emergency assistance programme, where when they have the need and there's no other option for them but to get away from their home situation, we have provided a package of support that will enable them at no cost to get safe emergency hotel accommodation for a short stay, which will include their children if necessary. We'll also provide transport to and from that accommodation. We'll offer to change their work mobile telephone number, but also, most importantly, we're going to hook them straight into one-to-one support, provided either through our employee assistance programme or actually through Surviving Economic Abuse. Now, the policies, the programme's only been up and running for a couple of weeks, and I'm pleased to say we haven't had to, to invoke the policy in full, but literally within 24 hours, we have had a colleague come forward and ask for support. And again, the feedback that we're willing to take that step at that real key moment of need has created and generated so much pride across the organisation. And then the other thing we've done most recently is really just ramp up again a lot of our communications and that support for line managers. So line managers are not only dealing with their own situations in being in lockdown, but they're also having to learn to manage people in a different way. So we've been doing a lot to provide them with additional guidance for how to spot the signs when working remotely, and some of those elements that Suzanne touched upon just in the right conversations. We've got some fantastic, signposting out on our interchange, just reiterating all of the various forms of support that we've got through a number of charities, through national helplines, promoting the 55 emergency number, again ramping up our focus around Bright Sky, and just lots of different ways where people can feel support at the time of greatest need. So they're probably the two most recent.
Yeah. That's great, thank you. I thought that was interesting in terms of, line managers have got a lot to deal with at the moment, but this is, this is another thing. What is the advice? What is the simple, practical advice that you're offering your line managers in terms of spotting the signs?
It's taken the time to really ask the question around how are you, and not just skipping on to the how many tasks have you done on your tick list, and really just listening for that silence or that awkwardness. And it's interesting, I think, whilst line managers are almost wrestling with the how do I manage somebody remotely, I think the fact, and I'm sorry I'm not on video with you all today, but we're all inviting people into our own homes using our various web tools, etc. So I actually think one of the positives to come out of this situation is I actually think we're building better and stronger relationships with our staff. Mm-hmm. So by creating that really open and honest atmosphere, and as I say, just pausing and listening, those are the key skills that we're asking. And we're not asking line managers to become experts. We've got all of our charity partners, and we are not stepping into territory that we're not qualified to do. It's literally, when we recognise the sign, having the right places to signpost them to as quickly as possible, and literally offering that follow-up support.
Yeah, great. I'm going to open up to conversation and questions in a minute, but just one final question, Dan. I know that Lloyds Banking Group has been doing work around domestic abuse for a while now, and I'm conscious that this is sensitive information, but have you got any numbers or anything that can indicate the impact and the success of kind of challenging stigma within your organisation, having these policies in place?
Yeah, so according to our group employee assistance programme, the disclosures have increased by 100%, and I don't have volumes to hand, and that's obviously from the data that they hold. But what I do get a real sense of is that colleagues are just overwhelmed by the level of support that the group have offered. The supportive feedback from colleagues, including those impacted, it is just, you know, amazing. I've got a quote here saying, "I just can't believe the bank is making this sort of support available. It's utterly amazing." You know, the support from those at risk of domestic or financial abuse is just, you know, outstanding. A friend of one of these colleagues is a social worker, and when she told them about this support, you know, her friend cried and said, you know, this is so needed. They've seen such a huge spike in people needing help, and this type of, you know, signal and with real substance behind it. You know, our colleagues just tell us they're so proud to work for us, and, you know, to be able to find our way through very quickly to the right support at that time of need is the most important thing.
Yeah, well, that's great. And what incredible feedback. Thank you to all our speakers. I'm going to open the conversation up to the group. Please feel free to type in the chat box if you have a question, or even just, if you'd rather, or shout out saying your name if you have a question for one of our speakers, or if you want to share some good practice that your organisation is doing that you think the rest of the group would be interested in.
Fiona, it's Nigel.
Hi, Nigel.
Hi, I sent something through to you on the web. Perhaps unusually, I feel in a minority here, and it's not the first time when this topic's been discussed that I felt that all of the panelists today are excellent and all are female. And although I can't tell the gender of the people who appear on the screen as a telephone, my guess is that the majority, again, of the participants are women, and that's similar to other meetings where this topic has been discussed, including City Mental Health Alliance meetings. And I guess my question is, whilst men are not the only perpetrators of domestic violence, and I'll be corrected by the experts if this is wrong, but I believe we are in the majority, what can and should be done to get men into the conversation?
Do you want me to comment on that, Fiona?
Yes, please.
Hi, Nigel. So you would be right to say that men are, unfortunately, the vast majority of those who use abusive behaviours, and particularly at the more severe end. So it's certainly not an exclusive club, but it does tend to be men. And indeed, men who experience domestic abuse are quite likely to experience it either in a child-to-parent situation or from a same-sex partner. So men do make up the vast majority of those who are using abusive behaviours. I mean, I think in terms of the question about how to involve men, I guess I'd almost bounce it back. You know, as a man who's taking part in this conversation, and you've obviously taken part in other conversations about domestic abuse, you will have a better feeling, I think, than I would, speaking as a woman, about what is going to bring men more into this conversation, because we believe passionately at SafeLives that this is not a women's issue. Hate that term anyway, but that, you know, there's nothing about this which makes it a women's issue. And, you know, if we think that the greatest number of those who experience domestic abuse are children, that's just as likely to be male children as it is female. And therefore, there will be plenty of men who have had an experience of abuse of some kind. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on how men can become more involved in the conversation in a really constructive way.
shows the dangers of asking a question, but a very, very sensible answer, if I may say so. I mean, part of the reason I'm in this conversation is because of my role within City Mental Health Alliance as one of the co-founders, and the fantastic opportunities every meeting I've been involved in has provided to learn from experts. And well, others in my family, I guess, would be better judges than me, but I don't think I've ever been accused of having engaged in the sort of violence, should we say, that is described. So I can't speak from personal experience, nor have I suffered it myself, fortunately. And I suppose it's difficult to speak on behalf of a constituency or a group of people of whom one has no direct experience. And again, something I've learned in my life is not to assume I know what things are like from the other side of the perspective, but try to put myself in those shoes. And trying to put myself, I suppose that there may be an embarrassment factor, a fear of being singled out for sort of everybody looking at the man in the room as if he is there only because he is an abuser and therefore needs to learn something from everybody else. And we've had similar things in relation to mental health over the years that have generally been more female than male participants in almost every gathering, I think. And Poppy will correct me if that's an overgeneralization. I'm sure there have been exceptions. And there, I think I don't want to be in a room admitting that I might ever suffer from something which stereotypically makes me weak, which makes me worse, which makes me less capable of becoming the leader I want to be. And I think we have seen a change there through senior men and women telling their story, including how going through a period of severe mental ill health has made them better people, better leaders, and so on. And I simply don't know whether there is any analogy there, but those would be some of my thoughts to answer your question.
Mm.
And Nigel, from a Lloyds Banking Group perspective, I do recognise a lot of what you've said, and I think initially when we started the whole mental health discussion many years ago, I think that was probably the case. I mean, our CEO came out and spoke very publicly about his own situation and his own mental health, and that really helped to switch people's views around to who might be susceptible. And very similarly on domestic abuse, one of our most successful ways of communicating is through stories, and we take the opportunity where some of our colleagues feel very comfortable to share their stories, and we've highlighted males who have actually been victims and survivors of domestic abuse. And the number of comments from the colleague base, getting involved in these conversations, it was absolutely through the roof. And the bravery, they talked about bravery and pride and all of these things. So I think it's sometimes about the stage of the journey, but I think you can start to really bring everybody in. And again, we've got poster campaigns up in every single toilet door across our estate, and we absolutely shine the light, and this is about everyone. And make sure that there are male helpline numbers as well as what are traditionally female helpline numbers on there. So I do think over time, as the conversation continues, that becomes less of a stark realization.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that's I think your point about the stage of the journeys is key. And to get men involved as we move along. Just speaking about the stages of the journey, there's another question that's come in the chat, which was in addressing this first time, what would be the very beginning? This is to all the speakers, and whoever wants to take it is please do. What would be the very beginning small steps, message communication into the organisation? Basically a supportive invitation that encourages people to come forward. What would be a good first step if nothing has yet been done? Heidi, would you like to take this? And maybe get the perspective from Diane as well after that.
Yeah, sure. I think certainly just raising awareness generally is always going to be a good thing, and encouraging managers, as has already been said, to have those supportive conversations, particularly during lockdown, and just asking those open questions without being too specific, you know, has to be a good message to get across. Mm-hmm. And you know, doesn't really require any particular expertise or knowledge, or so and it may not be, what comes back may not be in relation to domestic abuse, but just generally asking how people are and whether they're okay at home and so on. There's got to be a good thing. I don't have any other particular insights, I'm afraid, but
that's fine. That's good. Just before I move on to Diane to ask you on that, yes.
Sorry, just to come in quickly on that. I think there's a link maybe between the question somebody just raised and the one that Nigel raised. You know, I think sometimes we get ourselves a bit stuck thinking we've just got to go in through this very specific lens of domestic abuse. And I think exactly as Heidi's just said, it really doesn't need to be that way. And particularly where you're thinking about trying to draw people into the conversation who might be more reticent, there are much broader ways of having a conversation with your workforce, which are not necessarily going straight into, you know, here is what an abusive situation looks like and here's what we can do for you, but starts at a sort of wider lens, which I really feel like LBG absolutely nailed in the way that they've approached this, which is we are changing our relationship with you as an employer and employee. We want to help you be more of yourselves at work and be your absolute best at work at all times and stay in the company. And we'll find ways for you to do that, which might look like X, Y, or Z. Right. And I think to Nigel's point about bringing men into that conversation, so I persuaded the Conduit Club, after months and months and months and months of persuasion, I persuaded them to run an event for men to talk about men in relationships. And they were very squeamish about doing that, but when they opened it up, they were way oversubscribed. Wow. And I think there's always this this assumption that men don't want to talk about things or can't talk about things. It's just not true. It's just that nobody ever asks them. And this is not necessarily about men who've been victims of domestic abuse. It may be about men wanting to talk about their own behaviors and expectations and attitudes in relationships. So again, it's a bigger conversation. It's not just going straight into have you ever used abusive behaviors or whatever, but it's just opening up that conversation in a way that then creates incredible loyalty from your workforce and higher performance. I'm absolutely sure of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's about the whole relationship and not, things don't run in parallel. All these different policies just don't run in parallel. Thank you. Diane, did you have anything to add?
No, just probably just building very, very briefly on Suzanne's point around our sort of, you know, holistic approach and that bringing your best self. I mean, we've got a huge focus on the whole myriad of health and well-being at the moment, and building some really strong you know, support packages around that. And it's across, we've split it into 4 healthies, so we're going for the positive rather than the negative. So we've got healthy minds, healthy bodies, healthy finances, and healthy relationships, where you can just start to open up the dialogue, but also to build in all of those you know, realms of support mechanisms into that, which I think that's also been another huge success, to bring it is about everyone, and everybody will have good and bad, you know, mental health, everybody will have good and bad, you know, elements of relationships, and just how you really do normalize that conversation about, you know, it's okay to not be okay, and actually we do care about that.
Yeah, and to not be okay looks like many different things.
Very many different things.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to hand back over to Poppy. I'm also very conscious that there are big questions that have come through on the chat that we haven't yet answered. What I'll do is, for those particular questions, if you don't mind, I'll pick up with the speakers afterwards and I'll email the responses around, if that would work, just because I'm conscious we're running out of time. But thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all the questions, and I'll hand you back over to Poppy.
Thanks very much. Really, really insightful, and thank you so much, Suzanne, Jenny, and Heidi, and Diane, for your insights. It's 3 very different perspectives, but very aligned in terms of the messaging. And it was just really good to get so many different examples of things that we can do. One of the questions that's come through that we will explore further is, is there any guidance around how to support perpetrators of abuse? And that's something that when I, very early on, 20-something years ago, I actually used to work in a women's refuge, and on 2 occasions I supported women to leave their homes in the middle of the night, and so when you, Suzanne, started with that, this is, no organization is immune, and why does she have to leave and why doesn't he just stop? That really resonated with me and took me back to those early career experiences. Luckily, I was much more naive than I am now. So in some ways, there was much more resilience, I think, because I didn't know the full extent. I was just doing a job. But reflecting back, the impact that had on the young people, the children of those families that were also living in refuges, were very interesting, just heartbreaking in terms of the instability, schooling, friendship, living in fear. So that cycle, the vicious cycle, continues, doesn't it? Which is why I guess being able to address some of this through the workplace lens is a real gift, I think, that we can bring to people's lives. Because I think that we also talked about, because there's the intersectionality between LGBT plus and abuse, but the refuge that I was working with at the time were supporting BAME women. And actually, had their jobs created the opportunity, there might be opportunity for them to seek a different kind of help, because actually in both of those relationships, going to work was still okay, because the income was necessary and it was one of the control factors that the abusive relationship was hinged on. So I just do think that actually workplaces can be safe places and places where we find help. And I think your point, Diane, earlier around having a social worker reflect on how amazing the services that you provide are. I mean, I really second that. I think at work you can provide a level of support that can discreetly reach people that we would just otherwise not reach. So I'm not going to try and summarize everything that you've all said. I think it's been a very powerful discussion. I think there's something about us reflecting on the intersectionality between abuse and the other inclusion and diversity agendas that bring this to light. Mental health is clearly a factor in the whole of this journey, and I think one of the things that we need to recognize is the door into this for those people that we really want to reach might be about having a broader conversation around relationships and personal development in that context, and not going straight in with mental illness, abusive relationships. It's how we engage people through the wellness agenda, which we've done so well in the mental health narrative. I think the other thing is around storytelling. The power of storytellers when it comes to these issues could never be undermined. And I think I've heard women stand up on stage and talk about their relationships being tragic in this sense, but actually then still being able to hold very senior roles and do the jobs that they do and have on the surface a fulfilling life. And I think that where do we find men as well to speak from that perspective is going to be one of the challenges that we need to focus on. One of the things right at the beginning in my opening exercise that somebody, I think it might have been Kelly actually, who put, if only it didn't take a pandemic to focus on the important things. And I really reflecting on that, and it just sort of stayed with me as I read it. And hopefully the conversations that we're now having on subjects that are really hard and organizations have often dealt with as a periphery or a secondary thing, are now definitely are going to be driving the changes that we want to see. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, CMHA team, and thank you very much again to our guest speakers.
Thanks so much, Poppy. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
You all take care.
Bye.
Chat soon.
Thanks, everybody.